Uh, five, I think. All
It's
right, hello everybody. Welcome to Torn Tuesday, your weekly dose of all things Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. We've been doing this show for 10 years, and I want to introduce the host with the most, Cliff Broadway. Cliff, how are you?
Hi everybody. It's a great day here with Middle Earth fans joining us again to celebrate the legacy and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and of course, following that, Christopher Tolkien and all the many good works that he's provided us. Yes, as you can tell by that kind of an introduction, ladies and gentlemen, this week on Torn Tuesday, we're going to be talking about the probably, the most exciting and cool things that have happened here in this next generation of Tolkien fandom is the ongoing and very exciting posthumously published books that have been coming from J.R.R. Tolkien, who passed away from this earth in 1973, when I was just a youngling. Before I was adopted into the Jedi Academy, I knew naught of such things in this world. It was, it was a few years after his death that the biggest and most eye-opening at the time, I have to big buyer beware because now we have a new eye-opening book. But at the time in 1977, it was the publication of the Silmarillion that created a wonderful firestorm and lit the beacons, very much so, of fandom around the world. They were able to see greater glimpses beyond the curtain of the great mythology that was only tapped a little bit in the Third Age in the stories of the War of the Ring. Now, here we are, many years after 1977, and still another fantabulous and really eye-opening posthumously published book from the professor himself. And we have with us the wonderful gentleman and scholar, and I mean that in quite the literal terms, this guy's a gentleman and a scholar. We're joined today by Carl Hostetter, who is the gentleman who put together all this remarkable stuff at the behest of none other than Christopher Tolkien. And perhaps that is not the right way to describe the situation. I read your introduction so carefully, and I realize, Carl, welcome to the show. Welcome. It's so good to have you here. Welcome,
Great to
sir,
be here. Thanks.
from from across the miles. And you know, let's just say you had been working, like you said in your introduction, for a long time on these papers and things that people had not seen. And then suddenly more came to light, more came to you. And you didn't realize it way back then, but you started working on this book way back then, decades ago, perhaps.
Nearly 25 years ago, yes.
Oh my gosh, were we ever that young? I mean, wow. Someone tells me, do you believe, what Elijah Wood looks like at that age? He was only 19 or 20, maybe, all those years ago when Peter cast him, you know, and to play someone who's 56, right?
Mm.
But
Which is
this
how
is
Well,
old
we
I
this is
am
we should
incredibly
now.
exciting.
we should get into that because one of the big questions that fans have been having is ages, and the book goes into ages compared to how elves experience them, how different races experience them. I mean,
You mean aging?
aging and yeah,
Huh.
well, ages is a time frame, I guess. Aging.
Yes, yes. When you're
So
talking about a major epoch in the time of Arda, we often refer to them as ages. Yeah. So, all right, come on, Justin. What's your question?
well, look, we've been asking fans for weeks now to dive into this book, and they've been coming at us on email, on social, just with deep questions like, all right, I've read this chapter like five times, I still need to know. But can you explain, um, before we get into the nitty gritty details of this, like how did this project come about, and why was it this book chosen to be the first um, posthumous release, and then after Christopher Tolkien passed last year? Were you involved in these discussions of how this, why this book and why now?
It's purely an accident of chronology. It, it, it just so happens that right about the time I was finishing up my first proposal and major selection of texts, and had sent it off, um, and then began working in earnest on the rest of the book. Christopher, the day that everybody hoped would never come and yet did, inevitably must happen. So it was just there was no intent of this, being some event related to Christopher's passing in any way. It just worked out that way.
Did you were you collaborating with him in the years leading up to finalizing of this book?
So yes, I'd had a long correspondence with Christopher over the years, decades really. It slowed down a bit in the last years of his life, but he was certainly aware of what I intended to do with this book, or with this material that he had sent me. He approved of the idea, and he got to see my, a really good representation of my the work I was doing with the materials and my approach to making this book. So I did have his approval of not just the idea, but also the form of the book before he passed.
Is it wrong of me to romanticize Christopher Tolkien, as I often do, in terms of imagine one of the very first cross-Europe road trips that he made in an old station wagon with boxes and boxes of manuscripts in the back of the vehicle? I mean, that story has floated around in Tolkien fan conversations for so long. I'm not quite sure how much of it is real and how much it has become mythified. But to me, I do romanticize that notion of him driving to the south of France with boxes and boxes of things that were yet undiscovered, that were yet to amaze the world. I keep thinking, good heavens, what if there had been a bad mudslide or a rainstorm on any of the roads, trying to get down to the countryside where he needed to unpack the boxes? I just thought, what a precarious and wonderful little journey that must have been, Do you hear any of that? You've heard that story before, Carl?
Not that way. No, I mean, I did know that he did move all of his father's papers. I don't think it was all at once. I think it was probably done over time, to the south of France, at least in part because of tax advantages. Taxation in Britain was very, very high at the time. And I do believe that that's part of what prompted the move to southern France. I don't know the mode of transportation. I've never heard that before. And yes, I mean, certainly, well, I think the sense of how valuable his manuscripts are has grown greatly since the 70s. So that I think they were probably felt a little safer in just piling them into a car and driving around. You certainly would not do that today.
I've heard the story that it was this battered, beaten up old Volvo station wagon that he was determined to drive across the countryside and get those boxes down there so he could unpack them and get to work. And I swear it's almost become like it's, you hear it like the telephone game. By the time someone tells me that story the seventh time, it's got more added onto it each time. So
I haven't heard those details about the mode of transportation.
Okay.
Keep in mind, though, before he moved all those manuscripts down to France, they were in essentially a shed out in the yard. I
can't believe that.
See, now this is how small an act of destiny can change the course of the future. What if there had been some ridiculous bad electrical wiring problem and one of the outer structures or something, even a minor thing like that, could have burned and I'm thinking of what happened at the Aardman animation studios a number of years ago, where they lost much of their work.
Yes.
There's been, but now that's how I think about it in terms of that. Now, another side question about Marquette University. Maybe you might know something. How is it, of all the universities in the whole wide world, how is it Professor Tolkien landed such an amiable relationship with the good folks in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, at Marquette? How'd that happen?
So a man there at Marquette was looking to build the archives collection at Marquette. And Tolkien had recently published this massive book. And for whatever reason, William Reedy thought that this would be a good investment. As it happens, remember, Tolkien did not make a lot of money from these books for quite some time. He wasn't even paid royalties because he entered an agreement that Allen and Unwin thought that the book was going to lose money. So he entered an agreement that said that he wouldn't make any money until the book had recouped its cost. And then after that, he would get half of all the profits.
We're talking about the three. Are we talking about the 3 volumes and not the Hobbit, right?
Talking about the Lord of the Rings, yes.
The Lord of the Rings. But I've also heard that he passed on an advance on the book to negotiate that higher royalty for himself.
That may well be. It was certainly either a very shrewd decision or a very lucky one, because it certainly made him a very wealthy man later in his life. But at the time, I believe this was not long after the publication of The Return of the King, so 56, 57 maybe. Tolkien was strapped for money because he had an enormous tax bill to pay. And William Reedy comes knocking on his door, well, not literally, offering him money for the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit manuscripts. So he eagerly accepted. And I think partly he agreed to it as Marquette is a Catholic university. Tolkien himself was, of course, a devout Catholic. So that probably helped sweeten or ease the decision a little bit too. So that's how that came to be.
Thank you for reminding us of that story. Did any of your manuscripts that you were digging through and finding, they took you further on the journey towards the publication of this volume, in addition to the extra cool secret files that Christopher handed to you early on. You, as a researcher with a great body of your own work in Tolkien academia under your belt, you were able to go to Marquette and access things that most of the regular Joes and Schmoes couldn't even dream of seeing. It seems magical to me. I'm picturing you in my mind, deep, Gandalf under the library catacombs of Minas Tirith, looking through great dusty pages and having a cup of tea. I
would never drink tea around the manuscripts.
No, of course not. Do you know what? A lot of people watching the movie are like, Gandalf, what are you doing with that hot liquid near those,
Yes.
papers? Oh my gosh. But okay. You'll have to please forgive me, but I do have a really romantic notion of what it is you do that brought you to where you are, Carl. It's great.
So first thing I'll point out is it wasn't just me going to these archives. I had my team and colleagues in the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship. We went as a team to both archives and divided up the manuscript material amongst us and went through looking for anything of linguistic relevance. Of course, though, would pause and note some other things that were significant in other ways. Like, oh, look, everybody come here. It's the Book of Lost Tales notebook, and everybody had to just kind of hold that in our hands for a little bit. So yeah, it was a tremendous honor. It was a tremendous experience. I'll never forget it. I also got sick as a dog the first day at Bodleian because we worked for 12 hours straight, didn't take a break, not even for food and water. And so, because when we got there, we realized the magnitude of the work in front of us, and we knew we had to make use of every minute available to us. So it was very grueling, but just a wonderful experience. Christopher was always very supportive of us in terms of getting access to the materials in the various archives. I will say this: there's a couple of pieces in this book that Bill Fliss the archivist at Marquette actually brought to my attention for inclusion in this book.
Mm.
So Catherine McElwain at the Bodleian did similar thing. When they knew about this book and got an idea of what it was going to be like, they were suggesting materials to me. So I had some inside help.
That's great. The Bodleian exhibition that happened in the before times was wonderfully curated. Alec in the chat room wants to know, what's your background with Tolkien's works that put you in contact and began working with Christopher?
So it all grew out of my becoming editor of Vinyar Tengwar, which is the a journal of the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship. Because of that, I would have to write to the estate every now and then to get permission to publish certain things. And then fairly quickly after I started doing that, and of course, I was sending Christopher copies of everything as it was published. Christopher just wrote to me and says, "Here's my address, just write to me directly." So that's how that started. And I would typically, sometimes I would have questions about some manuscripts or readings. And I was always, telling him, here's what I'm working on. What do you think? And like I said, I was always sending him copies of everything that we published. So
that's great. And Alec, the same guy that
Excellent.
asked that question, wants to remind everybody that Tolkien fans can contribute oral testimonies toward the Marquette University Archive, and it's a very easy, simple process, and highly recommend going there. I think we might have visited there once and everything. So I saw in some
one more thing about Marquette.
Yeah.
Say one more thing. So I think it's been announced, though I don't think it's widely known yet, that Marquette has been in the process of digitizing all of their Tolkien manuscripts in high resolution color imagery, and they are making it available to researchers at the archives. So they're really going above and beyond to make this material available for people to work with without having to jeopardize the physical manuscripts themselves, because some of them are quite fragile. And every time somebody handles them, it degrades it a little bit more. Even light, exposing certain things to light will degrade them. So
that is eminently fascinating. That is so cool to hear that they are doing that with a digital excursion in that direction. I myself, working as a researcher for a big documentary that was on History Channel, it was called Star Wars: The Legacy Revealed. One of my jobs was to go downtown to the Los Angeles downtown branch library and get into their rare archives to pull out some volumes that they insisted, and the librarians who were cooperating with me were also very much saying to me, you have to have the most delicate care with gloves to handle these particular books that you're getting, and you're lucky to be getting them. And at this point, I mean, that was years ago, but now in 2021, I don't think I'd be able to go back to the special archives and get access to the same books.
Yeah.
It's a blessing, and the future generations of Tolkien fans and academics are going to be the beneficiaries of them having that digital processing done.
Absolutely.
That's very
And
cool.
they're
That's
also
very
taking
cool.
advantage of the digital platform to come up with electronic indexes into the material, so that if you want to look at all of the versions of a particular chapter, you can enter in in that direction and just go through each chapter. You don't have to go figure out what folder and what box and what folder it's in to bring it up. So they're really making full use of the searchability of a digital archive. So it's very exciting. It's really going to change the way people work with Tolkien's manuscripts.
I'm glad to hear it. Glad to hear that. That's very cool.
And obviously this work is being done with acknowledgement from the Tolkien estate. Christopher, you worked with and communicated with Christopher for decades, but he got a reputation after the movies came out, saying, I don't like those movies, and and his father, famously didn't like Walt Disney, and movies ruining fairy stories and stuff like that. But in some of your writings and responses, especially on this press tour, you've said that Christopher was actually very well read, very informed on culture, and kept up with things. And I think there was I think he maybe unfairly got a reputation of being an old stodgy guy that just didn't like movies, but that wasn't it.
No,
It feels like he was up to date, and he wasn't just an old 90-year-old exploiting his dad's work, but he was like encouraging your work and Marquette's work and the Bodleian's work and making this stuff more accessible to that.
absolutely. See, people have to remember that Christopher didn't just start working with his father's manuscripts after his father died. He
Mhm.
was, in a sense, a real collaborator on the work from before and then especially after World War II. He knew his father's works better than anybody but his father himself. So they mean a great deal to him. He does not take their treatment lightly. So he has a very much more critical and detailed and to in a certain sense, emotional relationship to his father's writings than probably anybody else on the planet. So
Absolutely, absolutely, and that became that became the fuel for all of his work on those manuscripts and things through his lifetime. I mean, the History of Middle Earth series on its own is an astonishing achievement. We were
absolutely.
and and now we can consider
Oof, I think we lost Cliff for
some
a second.
fans it's considered a rough draft in some ways.
So I missed part of what you said. You dropped out there. You said now we can consider, and then it cut out.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There are a lot in fandom who consider the original published Silmarillion more like a rough draft because of Tolkien's ongoing approach to rewriting and reworking and rethinking everything in his world.
Mhm.
Um, it's you know there was an amazing broadcast that Signum University had very recently. Our friend Corey Olson explaining in that talk with his audience that a lot of fans ask the question, why didn't Professor Tolkien ever finish writing the Silmarillion by the time he died? But as Corey Olson, the Tolkien professor, correctly points out, he had started, and that's what we have here in this book.
Right. And also, we see this too in Morgoth's Ring. Um,
Mhm.
Tolkien introduced some changes that simply made what he had written before unworkable, but he could never really bring himself to completely rework all of the elements of his mythology, which I'm glad for, because I think it would have been disastrous. Um, and Christopher, in that sense, made exactly the right decision to stick with the version of the tales that kept the sun and the moon as the flowers of the dying trees, and other such
Mhm.
elements that could
Mhm.
not be made to work with Tolkien's sort of scientifically revised view of the history of Middle Earth. Just could not be made to work.
How But how much do we all appreciate that Professor Tolkien would bother to apply not a linguist anymore, but a numerical and mathematical axiom to his world building? I have to stop everyone right now and say, wow. I deeply appreciate learning that more than I've learned anything. More than learning about the dancing bears of Numenor, okay? I'm I am I'm thrilled to learn that Professor Tolkien wanted to take a Frank Herbert, perhaps I dare not say that, but a real hard science approach to
Yeah,
his world building in terms of the science that he knew of during his time when he was alive.
right. And
It is it's wonderful. It's
you see
wonderful.
him moving in that direction even before he started work on Lord of the Rings. And while he was
Hmm.
working on Lord of the Rings, you can see where he's paying so much attention to getting details of the chronology right and the phases of the moon and things like that. So it wasn't as though it just suddenly started in the late 50s. He had been moving towards it for quite some time. Um, But so again, I say I think Christopher did exactly the right thing, and he gave us the best of both worlds. We have a coherent narrative form of the Silmarillion that is that holds together, in my opinion, very well. And then we get to see all of the nitty gritty manuscript tradition and sequences that lay behind that published work. So I'm in a way, I'm actually glad Tolkien never finished the Silmarillion, because otherwise we'd probably never have seen, his rich manuscript archives. There's just, I don't think there would be a market for it. So.
Indeed. Now, oh, I love it. I love this stuff. This is so great. I want to get in. Justin, do you have a question? Because I want to get into a very particular passage on page 216.
Yes, let me.
I really want to get. I want to get into the weeds in this particular passage because it's so illuminating on one of the most commonly asked questions about the narrative of Melkor and Manwë and their relationship and what happened. You go first, Justin, if you have a question.
I'll go for it because we're getting text messages on the hotline. Again, you can text your questions at the phone number on the screen, 530-64-FRODO. Yeah, that's really my phone number, 64-FRODO. Question on people love hobbits, right? And like Shire, the Shire folk are the ultimate entry point to Middle Earth. So on when going through all this book, and people wanted to know, like on Hobbit ages, is a 33-year-old Hobbit equivalent in maturity to like an 18-year-old, or do hobbits grow up the same as humans? They just choose to put off adult responsibilities until later in life.
So I think Tolkien had in mind that the average age of maturity for whatever race was in human terms 20. So I would say, I mean, when hobbits come to age, that equates to a human, say 20 years old. So not quite, probably not still a teenager, but still quite young. And of course, hobbits do tend to live longer than the average human in the Middle Earth. Not by double or anything like that, but longer.
So the stories, it seems like 33 seems to be the magic year where responsibilities are start getting assigned or taken up by hobbits, and of course both Bilbo and Frodo don't leave their house until they're 50. Right. But is that a 50-year-old human or?
No, not exactly. Probably more like 40 years old.
Okay.
That sounds about right.
But you look at sort of the sliding scales that Tolkien adopts for comparing aging of elves and the aging of Numenorians with those of just normal men. You can get a sense that hobbits' similar sliding scale would be a little broader than that of humans, and therefore ages would tend to correspond to less than the number of years that they have actually lived, sun years. So that's why. So 33, let's call that 20. 50, let's call that 30. This kind of thing.
Now, did Tolkien make an effort, or Christopher?
That's just my opinion, by the way. That's just my idea.
Well, your new book, The Nature of Middle Earth, or Tolkien's new book, which you edited, it's full of things like this. And the first thing that blew up the internet was the gestation period of elves.
Right.
that an elf can be pregnant for a year.
or 8 years or 9 years, or in one version there was even 108 years. Yeah. So what I've said about that elsewhere is you can't think about that in terms of human gestation. Elves found the time of gestation to be one of great joy. It wasn't pain. They didn't experience pain in childbirth. They presumably did not experience pain while carrying children. And so it wasn't to them a burden in any way. it was, as I said, a time of great joy. So don't think about it in human terms. Um, Tolkien makes it quite clear in a number of places, not just this book, that he regards the state of elves as being much like the unfallen state of man would have been. So all of the pains and labor that fallen man took on after the fall, the elves don't have that. So
Yeah. Well, before
Indeed. His primary consideration with everything with the elves is metaphysical. There's so much more that we understand after reading the Customs of the Eldar from History of Middle Earth series, added with the new things that you have in your volume. And it is abundantly clear that Tolkien's mindset is to consider these beings as spiritual beings, and that represents his deeply fundamental Catholicism in his work in the subcreation, or in his, the way that Tolkien thought of, appreciably, that's what the subcreation was for, was to celebrate the primary creator. And so he was so careful about that, and so careful and thoughtful about the metaphysics behind it. I find that incredibly attractive. Because
that's why, which is
very
part of the reason why Christopher sent this material to me, because he knew of my great and growing interest in such matters. So
absolutely.
I'll point out
Absolutely.
one thing more about the elves. Jonathan McIntosh had a book out a few years ago called The Flame Imperishable, which looks at the metaphysics, Tolkien's metaphysics in his writings. And he makes a very good point that if you remember the medieval great chain of being, there's God, there's angels, there's men, and then there's, animals and plants and so on. So there's this hierarchy of being. In a very real way, you could say that Tolkien's elves represent him wondering, well, what if there was an order of being between angels and men? And what would they be like? So still incarnate, but not fallen, and having much more command of their body and their desires. So,
indeed, the concept of forgiveness is constantly at play between the triangulation of Sam and Frodo and Gollum. We see that in that story quite often. But to see it between the Valar, I see it written in another parallel, and I want to go to page 216, if I can. I've always wondered, since I was very young, why the hell did they let Melkor out again? Why would anybody ever do that? Why? Why let him loose again?
right.
When the result of that was him teaming up with Ungoliant and the nightmare of the destruction of the trees. Why would that element of forgiveness come into play? And you know what? I was too young, perhaps, to get some of the subtleties, but I certainly get it now. I totally get it now. The concept of forgiveness in relationship to Sam, Gollum, Frodo means that Gollum is around when Gollum needs to be around in that part of the story when Frodo cannot save himself. It's the Lord's Prayer written in a microcosm of that relationship. Now we're looking at, on page 216, I get beautiful insights. Thank you for finding this material, Carl. It's really wonderful. Let me read a quick passage.
Sure.
Who then can say with assurance that if Melkor had been held in bond, less evil would have followed? Even in his diminishment, the power of Melkor is beyond our calculation. Yet some ruinous outburst of his despair is not the worst that might have befallen. The release was according to the promise of Manwë. If Manwë had broken this promise for his own purposes, even though still intending good, he would have taken a step upon the path of Melkor. That is a perilous step. In that hour and act, he would have ceased to be the vicegerent of the One. You're referring to Ilúvatar, becoming but a king who takes advantage over a rival whom he has conquered by force. would he then have the sorrows that indeed befell? Would we? Would we then have the sorrows that indeed befell, or would we have the elder king lose his honor and so pass, maybe, to a world rent between two proud lords striving for the throne? I can't picture that, honestly. Of this we may be sure, we children of small strength, any one of the Valar might have taken the paths of Melkor and become like him. One was enough.
Yeah.
Wow, that obliterates a question that has been hanging on me for many decades of my life. Because Manwë forgave and had that bandwidth of forgiveness for Melkor, it did lead to all the struggles and horrors and strife that came afterwards, but it also led to so much more. It has led to, as I think has been pointed out, it led to the, oops.
You're still here.
I guess, am I still here? Okay,
Yeah.
I think I lost my connection.
No,
If I'm still here, that's great. It just led to the ultimate showdown at Angband and the War of Wrath and the ultimate showdown with Melkor, where he was subdued and overcome finally. It led to so many other greater things because of that grace, that allowance that Manwë gave him. So I was really delighted to find this here. It's really great stuff.
I agree. I think that's one of the most powerful things that Tolkien ever wrote. And as soon as I read that last paragraph, and especially that last line, I knew I had to publish it as soon as possible. So I actually did publish that decades ago in my little specialist journal. But I wanted to bring it to the wider audience that I think it definitely deserves. So I'm glad you picked that passage. It's definitely one of my favorites. And it does illustrate.
I am so grateful. I'm totally grateful, Carl, about that. It's and it keeps us in a more aligned understanding of how Professor Tolkien primarily concerned himself with these things from the ground up. It was it was his Catholic feelings and metaphysics at play in the secondary world, but he would still not introduce direct things in the Lord of the Rings that showed religiosity. He had all of this stuff subtly woven in to the story and the characters and the situations, and it's marvelous, really.
Well, to that point, Magicus in the chat room says, one good thing about this new book is that it makes the Catholicism of the work more apparent. Do you agree with that? Or did you get that sense when you're putting this together?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's there. It's been there to see for a long, long time by those who know what to look for. But to me, the real key was looking at it from a metaphysical sense, which is why I think Tolkien describes it as fundamentally Christian and Catholic. He means that literally, in its foundations, in the fabric that everything is built upon. And that means it's metaphysics. But there's an appendix in the book on metaphysical and theological themes that I put together because there are places where if you don't understand to what metaphysical or theological feature he's alluding to, what he writes may not make much sense to you. So I put that appendix in there to draw attention to those places where Tolkien is clearly making an allusion that not everybody might catch. But I also I'm always careful to say, if that kind of thing does not interest you, you do not have to read that appendix. You can just ignore it if that's not your cup of tea. So,
a question from the chat: Would you say some of these changes are superficial, or in detail, something more fundamental to understanding his world a little more?
So no, I don't think there's anything in this that's really superficial. This is him actually digging down into the dirt of his own creation and seeing what is it built on? How does it all really work at below the surface level?
Well, Ben in the chat room says the metaphysical appendix was really helpful to understanding.
Good, glad to hear that.
So another question that just came up: was there anything you were disappointed to not discover?
Hmm. Well, like everybody else, it would have been kind of cool to know what Tolkien really did think about dwarf women and beards. There is a phrase in this book in a chapter on beards where you could interpret it to mean that they do not have beards, but you could also interpret it to mean that they do. So he doesn't really settle that question. I know early on when this book was announced, a lot of people thought it was going to answer that, but no, it doesn't really.
Well,
Uh,
Okay.
relatedly, we got
Okay,
to
hold on.
what?
but
Uh-oh.
It's barely half a page. Hair and beards. There's there's just a little bit. It's not a huge
well,
chapter.
the beards
Okay.
chapter is a bit longer than that.
Yes. The beards chapter is. Oh, look here. Now, you know what I found deeply cool? Mind pictures.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because even more than half the audience does not realize that they're watching telepathy happen between Hugo Weaving and Kate Blanchett in the
Right.
movies.
Well, and it's in the book too, where they're described as
Yeah,
sitting and silently in a circle, I
around
believe,
around the
and
fire.
obviously nonetheless still communicating. So yeah,
Yep, he mentions it so specifically in that one little spot,
right.
and that was enough to allow Peter and his editors to edit the film in such a little soft cross dissolves between the characters, and it's still not entirely literally in your face
Right.
that there's telepathy, but there is. And now here we are, mind pictures. And I just voraciously read this over and over about how difficult and maybe
Oof. Breaking up, Cliff.
or who prepared to deal with this, what it is like for them. Am I okay? I've got the worst connection right now. I'm sorry, but I love this stuff about mortal men being somehow terrified if they couldn't come to grips with the mind pictures that the Noldor might be sending to them.
Right. I guess it would be like they're seeing a ghost.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
some obvious phantasm. Yeah.
An-
Um,
Another so I guess the opposite question of what I had just asked about what not disappointed not to discover is was there anything where that just jumped out and you said, "Wow, I never knew Tolkien even cared about this kind of thing"?
dancing bears. Yeah, that's always my answer because I was just astonished when I read that for the first time. It's like, what? Dancing bears?
That is so Father Christmas letters.
It is. There's that great picture of the North Polar bear dancing with some penguins. I always think of that when I read that passage.
Me too. Me too. I love that. I love that. We did have some questions from some of our other staff at theonering.net. Okay, here we go. From Joel. When considered in total all of the material you presented to us in the book, The Nature of Middle-earth, what has it changed or added to your understanding of his work, such as the nature of elves versus men, the motives of the Valar, etc.? And would you say, I think that Justin, you may have already asked that
Oh
question.
yeah, I asked a version of that. Yeah, that's a great question. Like what has changed or added to your understanding?
Well,
I think it much more clearly can be seen that Tolkien views elves as essentially this order of being between men and angels, and that they are unfallen as a race. This establishes that fact and that point of view much more firmly than what had been written before. So I really was happy to see that. I was also very happy to see that he clearly knew his Thomas Aquinas.
mm-hmm,
No doubt about that now whatsoever.
mm-hmm.
And so I think those are probably the two most significant things for me personally, in terms of how I look at the nature of Middle Earth. How does it work? What ideas and conceptions is it founded upon? That's certainly the most far-reaching implication for me.
The interesting thing, we had talked with paleontologist Dr. Robert Bacher a few years ago, who, has kind of written the book on dinosaurs as birds, and he's, one of two leading names in paleontology right now. And he is a huge Tolkien fan, and he said that came from the fact that uh, Tolkien was at Oxford, in the first half of the century when, Oxford and the British Empire were funding most of the paleontological the expeditions around the world to dig up all these ancient creatures. So actually, he loved the fact that Tolkien being at Oxford gave him access to the bleeding edge of creature discovery, like real dinosaur discoveries, and you can tell he rolled that into the creatures he defined and created in this book, in his stories. So through all the notes and letters that you worked with on this book, what other than paleontology, are there other things that would have Oxford would have been like a leading source of new research at the time that Tolkien was there, and could have informed his creation?
Well, certainly earlier in his career, it was a real center in the English-speaking world for philology, for historical and comparative linguistics. Both, well, really all languages. I think, let's see, Sanskrit, I can't remember the time frame in which that started to be rediscovered by the West, or discovered by the West and really written upon. But it was some decades before Tolkien became a student even. But a lot of that was carried out, I believe, by Oxford. And of course, Celtic studies started to make inroads in Oxford as well. So I mean, obviously, the linguistics is the number one influence. Let's see.
In some of
He
these
also,
math equations and age equations and things like that you kind of go into in the book, was there, you know was Oxford studying like the different calendars of like the Mayan culture versus Egyptian culture versus Scandinavian culture? Like, were there some are there some parallels to, like, you know?
uh, I don't know in detail anything like that. Of course, the Roman calendar was a subject for anybody who studied the classics, which Tolkien started doing, started out as in the classics. So he would have been well aware of how that calendar system developed over time.
Hmm.
Mathematics, by the way, Lewis Carroll was a mathematician at Oxford when he wrote the Alice books.
Huh.
So, yeah, I'm sure mathematics was an important area of study at Oxford. The classics, I guess what could be called Scandinavian languages and literature as well.
Yeah.
I just, it's hard for me as somebody who didn't go to Oxford and hasn't really studied its history to say what particular areas might have influenced Tolkien that way.
Well, I guess it's an unfair question. I guess the better question is, in the notes and things that you've laid eyes on, are there references to, I talked to this professor or this adjunct, or are there references to like real people, real conversations that happened that might have informed?
So not so much in the material in this book, but there, you can tell from well, particularly if you're really into learning about aspects of Tolkien's life, the three volume set, the Tolkien Companion and Guide by Christina Scull and Wayne Hammond is simply indispensable. because you can find in there a record of all the people that he is known to have met or talked to or had a correspondence with, which did include quite a number of Oxford Dons. Now, to what extent those friendships influenced him, I couldn't say off the top of my head that I'm aware of such influences. Funnily enough, is that a word, funnily? Two of the things in here that I do cross-reference actually go to his two manuals that he would have been very familiar with, and in fact likely issued during his service in World War I, where he makes some very, I document it, you can see it's very clear reference to these manuals that he had gotten 40 plus years ago, but still obviously knew quite well or had them to hand. So, yeah, I think he was probably influenced by his books more than anything else, and his own life experience. But
yeah, well,
what I find, allow me to interject, I find it really fascinating that we always talk about Tolkien as a linguist. We always talk about him as a philologist. We always do. But now we have to start talking about him as a mathematician. And even, dare I say it, we need to speak about him stepping into the shoes of being a theologian to a certain degree. And that comes from some of the expanded vistas of his mind that are opened up to us now. Right. Now that we have your wonderful volume, I spend so much of my time studying Tolkien, all of my life, thinking about him in terms of a color painting. But lo and behold, now it's time for us to reassess the man in a whole new light. And I think it's really awesome to be in this position with this new insights we have, Carl. Really, it's very much appreciated.
Carl, do you think this is a reassessment of the rules, or it's? I mean, it's the age-old fandom question: is canon a locked thing, or does this change canon? Is this a reassessment of things, or is this just? Would it like? How should fans approach this text?
The good old flat Earth versus round Earth argument.
I would say from the front, as opposed to from the back, would be a good way to approach it.
Well said.
So I get asked about canon on occasion, and to me, canon is anything that came from Tolkien's pen. Period. All of it, and that's all. And what canon is that and only that. Now, obviously, other people have different views for different purposes, and that's perfectly fine. I think ultimately, though, we probably all, I believe I've learned this term recently, something called head canon, where people have their own views on what, is canon, what really happened and what didn't happen. So people will pick and choose what, they'll take what they like, they leave behind what they don't like, and that's perfecly fine.
That sounds like Tumblr mischief.
Yes, that's where I did first come across that term. So ultimately, it's all about your approach to the work and what you hope to get from it. Mine has always been a scholarly approach first and foremost. So my primary interest is in knowing what Tolkien wrote, and I don't try to make it all fit together. If your interest is instead to come up with sort of a coherent view of what really happened in Tolkien's Legendarium, there's all this material that you can now pick and choose, and if you feel like you can make it into a coherent scheme, that's great. More power to you. And then, of course, ultimately, there are people who just want to read good stories, and there, really does that too.
The interesting thing is. Go ahead.
I was only going to observe. It is someone in the chat room just saying, we don't need another Narnia, because we were talking about Tolkien's success at keeping certain things subtle instead of being so ham-fisted with them. And all I can say is, what we all want to be a fly on the wall back in time at the Eagle and Child. We all want to be there listening like a bug on the wall to Mr. Lewis and Mr. Tolkien, the two of them,
Right.
go at it. I can only, again, this is me, I have to admit, even with my own personal approach to scholarship, I romanticize everything. I have to, it's how I am. But can you imagine the delicious conversations between C.S. Lewis and Tolkien about applicability
Yeah.
versus, you know, allegorical intent?
Right.
You know, the author either takes control away from the reader or gives the reader complete bandwidth to interpret as they will.
Right.
I would have loved to have been there, wouldn't you?
Yeah, except I wouldn't want to be a fly. I'd want to be sitting there and have a pint in front of me.
Yeah, he'd be swatting away you as a fly off his beard.
Yes, I agree. We'd love to. We should. You know, I love this. This feels like we are breaking bread together every time we get together and talk. This feels like fellowship to me, and that's why I very much appreciate you taking so much time out of your busy schedule. And you've been doing the rounds, interviewing everybody, and you actually pulled one more out of your back pocket. Thank you for being with us today, Carl. This is really great.
Yes.
It's
Greatly
really lovely. But this experience of getting new insights means that Professor Tolkien was a perfectionist at the utmost level, and he was how many decimal points did he do that hard division?
I didn't count. I estimated. So it was about 360. Because I'm not crazy. I'm not going to sit there and count the digits.
I can't breathe. I can't, because I can't do math. Math is hard, okay? And here he is going from linguist to mathematician in a drop of a dime. But it concerned him. He wanted to make his legends, his secondary world, he wanted to have it carry so much verisimilitude, and that it was that important to him. The realization we have now that he was that thoroughly concerned in his world building is mind-blowing. It's just, it's fantastic, really.
Yep.
You know, the thing that has come up, you know, especially with Amazon doing a big show, Warner Brothers doing an anime cartoon, and, you know, like different studios doing different things, adaptations all over the place, is, you know, there's that famous quote or from that letter where Tolkien says he anticipated other minds wielding paint and drama production, you know, to build upon the foundations and columns. Do you feel
well,
that
he said, as a caveat, he said that was an early and perhaps overly wild, presumptive, you know, folly of an idea, and his one-word response to himself was absurd. Remember that letter?
Right.
But but then this text kind of supports that absurdity, and this effort and this book kind of attempts to establish some guideposts and some rules and regulations for other people to expand and the legendarium. Did you get a sense that, you know, that letter is famous because, you know, did he want all these adaptations? But, you know, did you get a sense that this is Tolkien and Christopher kind of, you know, laying some groundwork for others?
I hate to take the air out of a perfectly good question, but the short answer is no. I don't believe that Tolkien imagined that any of this would ever be published, certainly not the mathematical tables and such. The thing to remember about that claim is that the late part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, actually even more of the 18th century than just that, 19th century, was the heyday of folklore. So this was a time when there was a lot of collection of materials going on in Europe. So we got the Kalevala and the Brothers Grimm, and a lot of that material was taken up into the culture by composers and even dramatists. So that was simply how folklore material got its way into mainstream culture through those arts. I believe that's what Tolkien imagined he was doing when he was working on the Book of Lost Tales, that he was creating this body of folklore that then could be made into music or depicted in painting and such. I do notice that one word he does not use is pen or pencil. I don't think he ever wanted anybody to write stories set in his Middle Earth and his Legendarium. I don't really think
and maybe that's why Christopher. Forgive me for interrupting, but maybe that's why Christopher never did the Brian Herbert thing. You know that thing?
Oh yes.
That thing that Brian Herbert did. That might be why Christopher never did that.
He had zero interest in anything like that.
Bingo. Yeah. Bingo. Go ahead, Carl.
Well, I was just going to say, I really don't think that Tolkien felt that way as he was, say, working on The Lord of the Rings. I don't think he viewed this material as something that was going to be turned into a basis for artistic elaboration in the same way that the folkloric materials were, and which the Book of Lost Tales is very much more like than this sprawling epic of and surprisingly modern epic.
Yeah. So. Do you know if we've heard whispers that some of the materials that were given to you for this book were also shared with the writer's room on Amazon show in an effort for the Tolkien estate making an effort to like align adaptations with the new scholarship. Do you have any insight into that?
I have heard no such thing, and I frankly don't see how it could possibly be true, because they would have had to do what I had to do, which was sit down and interpret all this handwriting and figure out what it all says, and it would have had to come from Christopher himself, and I can't see him sending them photocopies of this material. So I don't think it's possible.
Thank you for saying that, Carl. We can put that to bed forever now, Justin.
Yes, that is done. So what were you working with? Like, was this like yellowed parchment paper that he wrote with an ink pen, or typewritten notes, or Post-it notes weren't invented until 73. So, like, what?
It's really kind of all of the above. Now, keep in mind, I was sent photocopies of this material, not the manuscripts themselves. Mm-hmm. But within that, I mean, Tolkien never threw away paper as far as I can tell. So he would use and reuse whatever paper was to hand, examination booklets, typewriter paper, printed publication notices from Allen and Unwin. He'd turn them over and start writing. And sometimes he'd go back to the front and just fill in the spaces between what was printed. Anything he could get his hands on, and he seems to almost never have thrown anything away. So that's wonderful.
He was the world's best academic hoarder.
Yes.
And I want to say that with love. Yes. Before I get any blowback, I want to say that with love, okay? But
well, if you think about writers today that do it all by computer, you're not going to see those layers of development unless they're doing version control backups or something. So it's a very good thing that Tolkien did not have a computer to work with, I feel. It would have made it easier to read what he wrote, but we wouldn't get to see how his thoughts developed.
Do you think Tolkien would have had an appreciation for the changing language of Twitter? And
well, I'm sure as a linguist he would have had taken interest in how language develops, in general. I have a feeling he'd kind of be dismayed by emojis and lol speak and that sort of thing, or he just wouldn't know what to make of it. But who knows? I didn't think he was interested in calculating ratios out to 360 digits either. So.
Oh my goodness. I'm so sure that a gentleman and a scholar like Professor Tolkien, who can be remarkably loquacious when he wants to be, I do not think that he would like to be, confined to 140 characters.
Oh, no, no.
That would
Oh
not
no.
work.
Yeah.
Are you kidding? No.
But as we look at this new era of the legendarium, and you've got these different adaptations coming from different and ungodly amounts of money being spent on making them, let alone marketing them and everything like that. First and foremost on fans' mind, and I think Cliff termed the phrase fidelity to Tolkien. And I think this book, The Nature of Middle Earth, is a continuation of the rule set, and expands, some of those details. But, what does fidelity to Tolkien mean to you? I mean, is it should adaptations be, specific to the text that Tolkien's hand, or is there room to play in the lore as long as you get the vibe right? I don't know, like.
Well, to me, it fundamentally comes down to whether it's faithful to the themes and characterizations of the written works. And I can probably just leave it there. Otherwise, some of your audience might get angry at me. I think we can all agree that Peter Jackson did a terrible job of that with The Hobbit. So,
well, we had some staff members of the One Ring walk out of the Two Towers when Sam gives his epic speech that makes you cry at the end of Two Towers, where he says, "By all means, we shouldn't even be here." And someone stood up and said, "You're right. You shouldn't be at Osgiliath," and walked out of the theater.
And
no, see, I'm not.
they did.
I'm not that kind of.
So, yeah,
I'm that kind of stickler. I don't really mind what was left out. It's the things that are put in that don't belong there. That's what gets to me.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Thank you. I'll totally agree with that. I would also say I would venture in a slightly Peter Jackson apologist statement, and I'll make it slight, that Peter did a better job adapting Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, than he did adapting another best-selling book, The Lovely Bones. But we'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
But on to the idea of everybody getting something out of it. Like you said yourself earlier, Carl, there's something to be appreciated in that level of success. There was a decade when people were talking about the Vietnam War in terms of the battle of the War of the Ring and certain conflicted political parties or military interests. And then generations later, they're seeing more commentary on industrialism and the destruction of the natural environment. Not the same way that people were looking at it in previous decades. The applicability shifts right under your nose. Under your nose, it happens. Time is passing. There's another generation of young people reading The Lord of the Rings, and they're getting a whole new fresh take. And what is applicable, Professor Tolkien had it all built in there, and the reader is the beneficiary who gets to go on that journey of discovery and finding these things in the story. That is its own reward, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, yes. It's clearly something that Tolkien succeeded at, well, frankly, better than any other 20th century author.
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm glad to see that the critical appreciation of Tolkien has grown over the past several decades or so. I still don't think Tolkien's really getting his due as an author sometimes that I think he deserves. And particularly, like studying his prose, how it is that he creates the almost lyrical effect in prose, the way he does that. It's so distinctive. You can read a passage of Tolkien and it was Tolkien who wrote it, and not anyone else. So I think there's a lot more area for appreciation and study there. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but at least some people are doing it now. For a long
Mm-hmm.
time, it was just regarded as, children's literature, and it was viewed dismissively as a simple story of good versus evil, and the good guys always win, the bad guys always get defeated, and and nobody who'd actually read the book could hold that view. So, um,
Yeah.
Indeed. I like watching the old BBC stuff on YouTube that shows the college kids having somewhat interesting intellectual arguments and major disagreements about what they saw or read in The Lord of the Rings and what they don't like about Tolkien at the
right,
time. And of course, it was in the late 60s that the American counterculture fueled an explosive level of sales in The Lord of the Rings. Um, and Tolkien didn't want those kinds of fans. He called them my deplorable cultists who
yes,
followed his books around and yes, I when I was at Oxenmoot a number of years ago, a long number of years ago, thank you, and I interviewed Verlin Flieger. Did I mispronounce her name?
it's
Uh,
Flieger. That,
I did mispronounce. Oh my goodness. We did have a conversation comparing the way the American Tolkien Society ran things versus the original Oxford-based Tolkien Society, and that was an enlightening and interesting conversation
right, right,
when we interviewed her for the documentary.
yeah,
And just fascinating to me. You're right in observing that the scholarship has grown and matured and is also still being taken very seriously. And there was a recent piece in the Guardian that you may have seen it, that identified Tolkien on the same level as
Oh,
Homer
you're breaking up.
yeah.
and Dante
I, I
Alighieri.
did, I did see
And
that.
that,
Yes,
am I
I
breaking up
noticed
again?
it.
You did see that? Yeah,
You did a bit.
and I think, yeah, we're getting to that point, I'm sure, where the professor's work is going to be held as on the great level of the greatest classics of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and beyond, and Dante's Divine Comedy,
Yeah,
which itself is also a fascinating theological adventure on
yeah,
its own.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, people will still be reading Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, especially 100 years from now. Is anybody going to be reading Dan Brown 100 years from now?
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
Not at all. So
No.
where does the legendarium go from here? Now that Christopher has gone, and the Christopher and his father are pretty much the only Tolkien's wrote Middle Earth stories. So where who's in charge now at the estate, and where does it go? Does this turn into, is this book the start of just a more scholarly publishing record from the estate?
So, if you're asking me about further writings by Tolkien on Middle Earth, I have to say that unfortunately I'm not aware of any substantial amount of material. And most of what I do know about is just simply other versions of things that, aren't fully published in the history of Middle Earth. Um, I don't see another book like this coming out. I'd love to be wrong about that, but I have nothing that I've seen or heard or gives me any indication that there will ever be another such book as this.
Hmm.
Um, there will be, I think, more work on Tolkien's academic writings. And I know that for a fact. And there's plenty of that has yet to be published. But of course, the audience for that's going to be somewhat smaller uh, than it is for his Middle Earth works. As far as, I don't know who's in charge of the estate, but I mean, the members of the estate are well known. It's Bailey Tolkien, Christopher's widow. Priscilla Tolkien, I believe, is still involved with the estate. Um, Kathleen Blackburn, a longtime lawyer for the estate, is on the estate as well. Simon Tolkien, and I think Michael George Tolkien is also on the estate board now. Um, where they see things going, I don't know.
Hmm.
I was as amazed as anyone to see the Amazon deal being made. Um, but yeah, I don't really have any insider knowledge with the estate. I mostly corresponded with Christopher and sometimes with Kathleen. I have had some correspondence with Bailey, just a little bits, especially since Christopher's passing, but it's always just been nothing business related since that time. So,
Do you think there's room, like if someone well accomplished, let's say a guy like Neil Gaiman raised his hand and said, "Can I write a book? Can I write a story?" Do you think there is room for that
Neil
now?
would never do that. He would never do that. He would never do that.
you mean Neil
Okay,
Gaiman wouldn't, or the
but
estate wouldn't allow it?
no, no, no. Neil Gaiman would never dare do that. But for the sake of a illustrative hypothetical, we could
Yeah,
consider it. But I know that personally speaking, Mr. Gaiman would never do that.
I would agree with you. I think based on what I know about Neil Gaiman. I have no real knowledge about this question, but just from my own interpretation of where I think some people stand on the estate, no, not anytime soon. But
Well,
again,
what a
I could
what
be
a,
wrong. I would have bet big money that the Amazon
yeah.
series would never have been permitted. So
Oh yeah,
Well, I,
that was huge.
I have to admit, I am deeply surprised by the little image, that teaser image that they revealed, because, you know, are we to suddenly, with great deal of shock, realize that maybe portions of the Silmarillion have been licensed to be adapted for the screen? That's never happened before,
right.
ever, ever. So, I mean, it speaks to a larger deal, might be a lot more fluid than we thought.
Maybe.
Yeah,
Um,
my takeaway from this book was it actually gives a lot more latitude to the Amazon show. I mean, like you said, dancing bears and Numenor. You know, there's so much. You know, even in small segments, you'll just get to a sentence. You're like, oh, okay. There's so much here that you've put together, and made it make sense. That it gives you a sense that okay, whatever rights or whatever Amazon's doing, I mean, there is room in this legendarium for some fantastical stuff and some, and I think you're the my takeaway from the book is it just expanded everything. It didn't
hmm,
contract anything. Everything is more open, more possibilities. Now you go back and start reading about, start reading Lord of the Rings, and like things come into focus, and you're just like, oh my god, I know what's happening in their heads now. Like,
right. Yeah, I mean, if they have or can get the rights to at least some of the material in the book, there's obviously there's a lot of descriptive stuff concerning Numenor and Numenorians that would could be put to good use.
Mhm.
Whether they have those rights though, or could get them, I don't know. I
Mm.
kind of doubt that they have it
well,
because when this book wasn't even formally proposed, I think when those rights were being negotiated. So I
Mm.
don't see I don't see how it could have happened. Um,
Well,
that doesn't.
Amazon, if you're watching and you're putting together the season 2 writers room, there's a licensing opportunity right here with our friend Carl. If
No,
you
no, don't
really
come
want
to
to
me.
dive in.
Don't come to me. It's not up to me. It's the state.
Indeed, indeed.
Well,
Oh, come on.
what a treat! What a treat that you that we got to talk to you today, and what an experience to work
It
with
is.
Christopher till the end and be so close to him and be so close. You're probably the closest person to Tolkien alive right now. Closest to the legendarium, closest to the work, besides family. You know, and what a treat and what a privilege and what a what an accomplishment. putting this book together was.
Yeah, the privilege has been all mine, of course, because I mean, in addition to being able to do this really great work, uh, by which I mean that I'm not saying I'm great or anything. I mean, but the work is of a great nature. It's important work. Um, Above all, what I got out of it was my getting to know Christopher Tolkien and having some correspondence with him for 3 decades. He was my real audience for this book, first and foremost. And you probably noticed it's dedicated to his memory in Quenya.
That was beautiful, by the way. Yes, that was beautiful.
Yeah, it was. I knew I couldn't not do that. So um, that was a great privilege for which I will always be grateful.
Excellent. And we are the beneficiary of your work. And thank you very much, good sir, for being with us on another Torn Tuesday. To feel so welcomed to Tolkien academia, we've gone a long way towards that. Instead of it seeming cold or distant or somehow inaccessible, it's really not. I mean, for those people who want to sign up and get their memberships, you can get your paid membership to the Tolkien Society. You can be a card-carrying member. You can take access to online classes, and our friends at Signum University have become a real university now. And there's this brand new book that just came out, and you guys got to get your hands on it, because this is an excellent doorway to feel welcomed to the table of Tolkien scholarship, and it's great. It's really great stuff.
And just to connect this new book back to Tolkien, everyone knows the story of why the Lord of the Rings is 3 books, right? Mm-hmm. There was a paper shortage, and
a paper shortage. We have to talk about the problem.
Oh, we lost Cliff again.
We have to, because a lot of people are going to want to buy this as a gift.
Yes.
Okay?
So
there are problems with paper.
In the year 2021, there's a paper shortage. No joke, there is a little paper shortage. So if you want to get this book for your friends, your family, yourself, for Christmas, for the holidays, buy it now, because there is a paper shortage, and the publishers have said they don't know when they're going to get a reprint in, because there's a literal paper shortage, just like when Lord of the Rings was published. So talk about coming full circle with Lord of the Rings.
Yes, literally, the supply chain in general is experiencing lots of problems now. So yes, it's words to the wise. I don't, by the way, I don't get royalties for the book, so I'm not selling anything here.
You're selling the love and passion for Tolkien.
There we go. Yes.
That's absolutely true. Is there an ebook version at all?
Yes. Yeah. There's certainly for Kindle, and I think some other platforms as well. Yeah. Very good. And remember, you can use the Kindle search feature or whatever platform you have to look up things too, which I find I use that ability all the time with Tolkien's books that are on Kindle. So,
do you know what? You have to, if you kids haven't read it yet, there's stuff in here about mind pictures and about, the aging of Númenórean men, and bringing beautiful presents to the bears and exchanging. It is, somebody else online before me thought, oh, there's a little taste of Winnie the Pooh, a little A.A. Milne in there, a tiny, tiny little shade of that.
I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, I can see that.
It actually, to me, feels like, the Father Christmas materials. Yeah. I love that. I love it. So this is really delicious to have you here, and you're welcome back, my friend. Come back to the conversation and join us at the table anytime if you'd like. Sure. Oh, it's super good. And to our faithful audience, I have to say thank you. Thanks for coming back to see us again week after week and being part of the community. We're all in this together. Let's have a good time, everybody. So until next week, I wish you all a very safe journey and a safe night. And my hat's off to you, Carl. You got everyone's looking at the shiny bald head now, but my hat is off to you, sir. Thank you for all of the many, many years of dedicated work and like serious, thank you for putting a fine-tooth comb on all this stuff because it's wonderful. So cheers to you, man. The next round is on me when we're together, okay?
Excellent.
Next round is on me. So, and to the rest of our audience, we'll see you next week on theonering.net. Until then, good night and good luck, or rather, buenos noches y buena suerte. Bye, everybody.
Very good. Someone just asked, who do you want to do the audiobook? Who's your dream voice?
I don't think it's that kind of book. I mean, parts of it. Particularly if you're in the US, get yourself a membership and come to MythCons. It's a great, great mix of scholarship during the day and hijinks at night, all in good fun. But to me, it's a perfect combination of academics and having fun. And they're a very, very welcoming group of people. So
yeah, I love it. That sounds fantastic.
And I will
That's great.
I will be at the next MythCon that is in person. So